Welcome, and thank you for tuning in today. I hope that the words that we share with you today are an encouragement to you and help strengthen you in your relationship with God, and especially during times such as we are facing in the midst of this pandemic. Our focus today is on the idea of faith. And so I hope that the words we share will encourage you in your faith and certainly in your relationship with God. My name is Bob Turner, and I work with the Sunset Academy of Leadership Training, otherwise known as SALT. And I am so thankful for the opportunity to share with you a few words that will be an encouragement to you as we think about this great subject of faith. In our world today, it's very difficult to know what to believe sometimes, or to know who to believe. And we're challenged with understanding what we can touch and what we can't touch, and where we can go and where we can't go. And sometimes even our faith is challenged as we think about the stay-home orders that have been given and issued and the social distancing that exists. And so sometimes even our faith is challenged. But when we think about this idea of faith, how do we define faith? What does that faith mean? Or when we think about a people of faith, or perhaps even the application of faith, usually our minds turn to Hebrews chapter 11. And if you'd like to turn over there, we're going to look at a few thoughts from chapters 10 and chapter 11. But before we do that, I want us to think a little bit about the background of this particular letter or this particular book. This letter was written to a group of Christians for the purpose of encouraging them. He's trying to encourage them not to walk away from their faith. Many, it seems, had already done so. They left Christianity, they left the church, they were going back to what we might consider to be something that was more familiar to them. And so maybe it's that they wanted to see the priest offering the sacrifice. Maybe they wanted to feel the blood of the animal that was being sacrificed for them, being sprinkled on them. A lot of thoughts race through our minds, but this letter is to encourage these Christians not to leave their faith, not to leave the church and to go back to whatever it was before. And so in this particular letter, he's encouraging these Christians. In fact, he even at one point tells them that they had already endured a great conflict of suffering. They had shared in the persecution. They showed sympathy to prisoners, even having their own property seized. In the last part of chapter 10, in verses 35 and 36, he's going to emphasize there how that they need to not throw away their confidence, which has a great reward. And he tells them that they have need of endurance so that after they have done the will of God, that they may receive what was promised. It's based on this that when we get into chapter 11, when we look at verses 1 and following, we're going to find that he begins by helping us understand the definition of faith. And from that, we're going to see several thoughts that hopefully will encourage us and strengthen us in our faith today. He says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for. It is the conviction of things not seen. First of all, I want us to notice that he tells us that faith is the assurance of things hoped for. So faith is about hope. Now, when we think of the word assurance, maybe we think of confidence or we think of being sure about something. This particular word has to do with a realization. It's by our faith, our continued faithfulness to God, that we realize this hope that we have. Now, hope in the book of Hebrews is very significant because back in chapter 3, verse 6, he's going to instruct these Christians to hold fast their confidence and the boast of their hope firm until the end. And then he's going to point out in chapter 10, verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. We have two passages that are very similar in nature, as both of them emphasize the need for us to hold fast. What's interesting is in between these 2 points, we find in chapter 6 that hope becomes the anchor of our soul. It is steadfast, it's sure, it's entered within the veil where Christ has entered as a forerunner for us. So the idea is that this hope that is our anchor, this hope that we're to hold fast to, is wrapped up in Jesus. You see, our hope is not based on who we are, nor is it based upon what we have done. It's based upon who he is, and it's based upon what he has done and where he is now. And so because of that, faith has a great connection to this idea of hope and our realization of that hope. Then secondly says that it is the conviction of things not seen. The idea of conviction probably raises a number of different thoughts, and maybe we think of a number of different people that have conviction. And certainly this particular word, sometimes even though translated as evidence, has to do with something even far more important. The idea of this word has to do with proving. It's associated with reproof or correction. But this particular thought is that faith has to do with proving that which we cannot see. Now, what's interesting about chapter 11 is we have over and over these individuals listed who did that very thing. They proved their faith by their obedience. We find that they not only offered, they obeyed, they worshiped, they left where they lived, they continued to endure because of their faithfulness, their faith. And so we find that this idea of faith not only has to do with the concept of the realization of our hope, but it has to do with proving that which we cannot see. But that leads us to a third area that I want us to think about and consider in regards to faith. And that is that it has to do with vision. When we have faith, it changes how we see God. It changes how we see others. And it certainly changes the way that we see the circumstances in our life, no matter what they may be. I'm glad that the writer of Hebrews uses this terminology of seeing or unseen throughout the text. In fact, I encourage you sometime to go through the text and just highlight those various phrases. For example, in verse 3, it says, "By faith, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of that which is visible." And then we find in verse 5 that by faith, Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. And he obtained this testimony that he was pleasing to God. Now that's a very important thought, because in the last part of chapter 10, he's going to quote from Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, where God said, "My righteous one will live by faith, but if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him." See, Enoch was pleasing to God, and it was connected to his faith, his faithfulness. And that's why it goes on to say in verse 6 that without faith, without our faithfulness, it's impossible to please God. For those who come to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. I love verse 7. It goes on to talk about by faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, prepared an ark to the salvation of his household. And the text goes on to list out many others. But I want you to notice verse 27. Here we learn about Moses. And the text tells us that Moses fled Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, and he endured as seeing him who is unseen. That is the thought we need to keep in mind, because faith has to do with our vision of God. And we need to realize that even though we might not see him with our physical eye, it's through the eye of faith that it changes the way that we see who he is. And of course, it changes how we see others. No longer are we going to recognize people according to the physical appearance. Instead, we see the soul of the individual and the importance of that soul being in relationship with God. And then, of course, we find that it changes how we see our circumstances. The end of chapter 11, as it lists out all of the various activities of these people and what they endured, the circumstances that they faced, challenges beyond what we can fathom, and they endured. And the text tells us that these are people with whom the world was not worthy. What a powerful thought. I don't know how long the circumstances we face today are going to last. A week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, a year. We may feel the effects of what we're dealing with now for years to come. I don't know. But what I do know is that we need faith. We need faith that helps us to hold on to that hope and the realization of that hope that will come. We need the kind of faith that is about proving that which we cannot see. And that's why faith is about our vision. Because when we have faith, it changes how we see God. It changes how we see others. And it certainly changes how we see the circumstances that we face. Maybe that's why the writer of the book of Hebrews tells us in chapter 12 that we need to fix our eyes on Jesus, because he is the author and perfecter, the completer of our faith. What a beautiful thought. I hope that the words that we've shared today have been encouraging to you. And I hope that when we deal with the circumstances that we're facing today, whether it's this stay-home order or we're quarantined or we're facing economic challenges, whatever it is, I hope that we'll remember the importance of faith. Faith, the assurance of that which we hope for, the conviction of that which we cannot see. Faith. Thank you for tuning in today. I pray that you've been blessed, that you've been encouraged, and that your faith is strengthened in the one who is truly in control of all things. May God bless you today.